The key is to have chosen intentional moments of uncertainty and then reflect on them. Just go out of your usual patterns and paths and reflect on the growth that you feel as a result.
Hi, I'm Neil Perkin, the host of Think with Google Firestarters. And Firestarters is a series of insightful conversations with the interested and the interesting of the marketing, advertising and innovation communities. And today I'm speaking with the entrepreneur, speaker and author Sam Conniff. And Sam is the founder of Uncertainty Experts. He's the author of the best-selling and wonderful book, Be More Pirates, and also the former co-founder of Liberty, which was the multi-award winning social enterprise and youth-led creative network. So Sam, delighted to have you on Firestarters. Welcome. And what's your provocation, if I can just dive straight in, what's your provocation for the Firestarters audience?
Thank you very much for having me. And my provocation to all of you would be that I think the need for a new paradigm of leadership is so great that we might be better off or have more to learn from ex-gang leaders and refugees, ex-smugglers and prisoners of war, people who've been through gender transition or even the criminal justice system, than we do of the current demonstration of narrow-minded and backward-looking leaders so often on display. And the reason I say this is because I think the number one challenge we face, sitting behind all of the surface symptoms that are causing us such difficulty, is uncertainty and our ability to turn it into opportunity. And I think by looking into the shadows of people who've learned the arts of uncertainty but have now become leading lights in society, we've probably got more to gain from people whose trajectory has been more obvious.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a awesome provocation to dive into. So you listed out quite a diverse sort of range of different people there, and who do lots of different things. So what is it that they have in common then? What is it that we can actually learn about navigating uncertainty from them?
Well, I'll take one step back, because I do know that there's an awful lot of good leaders out there trying to wrangle with these things. And so I don't want to cast too much of a blanket. But when I began this investigation, I looked at the career trajectory of the UK Cabinet Office. And this was mid-COVID, so crisis upon a crisis upon a crisis. And there were only three careers represented: media, law and finance. And so it's that framing. We're so wedded to a particular type of hierarchy and meritocracy that it's led to a homogeny of ideas and imagination, and I think actually a vacuum of imagination at the top of many of our institutions that's deeply problematic. And yet at the same time, if uncertainty is the challenge that we face, there are individuals all around us, everywhere, being overlooked and misunderstood. I can't remember the exact statistics, so these are generalized, but 250,000 young people in gangs, nearly 1.2 million people living in abject poverty, 12 million people living on the breadline. Can't remember the millions of single parents, ex-vets, people whose just daily life, getting to the end of the week, is an extraordinary feat of navigating uncertainty, of emotional regulation, of problem solving, of complex decision making. And it just strikes me that in the midst of such a live conversation around diversity and identity, we're missing some of the real benefits out of deeply getting involved in those topics on a human level. And so I began an investigation, and I started a series of interviews and I came up with the definition of an uncertainty expert. They had to have such a prolonged period of exposure to uncertainty that they'd neurologically rewired. They weren't just opportunistic, right? They began to see the world differently with a repeatable set of patterns and behaviors. And then to ensure that they weren't stories of survivor bias, where remarkable people do remarkable things no matter the circumstances. What I looked for was people who'd been exposed to uncertainty in the shadows. So my sources were ex-gangsters or ex-refugees or ex-prisoners of war, but they'd gone on to become leading lights in society. So there's a moral arc to these stories that we learn something from, but they were still using the same skills. So whether they're now business leaders or CEOs, whether they're trauma specialists or head teachers or they're advising politicians, they still cite the same techniques for adapting uncertainty. And in a way, that means they've had a duality to their success, because it takes a fuckload of tenacity to be a successful gangster or ex-smuggler or whatever else. And then the final part of the puzzle came when I was introduced to the Decision Making and Uncertainty Center. who are a specialist and fairly niche lab at University College London. They sit within the brain sciences department. So combining neuroscience and psychology, and they were brought into existence after the financial collapse to look at how organizations and individuals make better decisions in times of uncertainty. And this glorious moment happened when the 7 or 8 tools that I'd been able to identify from all my interviews that were very, very consistent across all my sources completely lined up with these this handful of scientific concepts that the DMU were recommending. And then I had these great stories that people can lean into. There's a narrative there that's always going to invite human synaptic intervention, and then I could back them up with really robust but also quite cutting edge scientific theory, and that combination became the genesis of Uncertainty Experts.
That's so fascinating. And so tell me a bit more about the kind of neurological rewiring. So how do these people think differently? What is it that they do differently from the rest of us, perhaps?
So uncertainty is, well, let's do, on a human level, let's think about it first. So, you know, the kind of quote I think that brings this to light is, you know, in life's rich school of war, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, I think is something that would like largely all agree to be pretty true. But I observe that that's more true retrospectively than it is proactively. Like, you know, we can look back on events and glean what we learned, but no one looks towards the coming show of life and thinks, great, what an opportunity to get stronger, right? So the capacity at which we learn, the journeys which we've had, the stories that you proudly retell in the pub for the 100th time, you know, the best career moments of our lives. I bet you, all of you listening, there is a direct correlation between the improbability of those events, between the amount of chance and risk and unlikeliness. And the greater that was, the better that story is and the prouder you are. Few and far between are the best events of our lives that went exactly as planned or were predicted. So that begins to suggest there's evidence here through history and through our own experience that uncertainty is a catalyst for innovation and for change, and very often for bringing out the very best of us as human beings. But neurologically, uncertainty is seen as a threat, and part of our ability at survival this long is, you know, the humans have always sought out sustenance and shelter and social cohesion groups. Those 3 things have got easier, but survival and on a nervous system response level, that's avoidance of uncertainty, has become trickier because what will be triggered in the body as a threat has become greater. Notifications, rolling news themes, you know, the sirens, just the endless high arousal of life. So uncertainty is something that we've begun to have a kind of almost anachronistic relationship with. It triggers a fight and flight response, but fight and flight is not appropriate for the amount of uncertainty that we find. So there's a need, a calling on us to evolve our abilities in uncertainty. However, paradoxically, uncertainty is the exact opportunity that we need. Uncertainty is shown to push the human mind into its almost optimum state for learning. The neuroplasticity that was thought previously not to occur in later life, one of the key ways you can trigger it is moments of uncertainty. It's like the F. Scott Fitzgerald line, the identifier of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposing ideas in mind at once. He's talking to the same thing, but it's been proven now in study after study, most recently at Yale University in 2020. In moments of uncertainty, the brain and the body seek, they achieve a higher level of arousal. Your smell, your sight, your senses become more aware. Like anyone who's been in a really difficult moment or even an accident, you know, time slows down, you become more aware, deeper memories are laid. And uncertainty provides an opportunity to do that. So it's both something that we struggle with and emotionally fight against, but it's something that provides a huge capacity and opportunity for evolution and adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, there was something really interesting you said. I think it was in the Do Lectures talk, which I saw you give. And you mentioned about how fear shows up in the same way that excitement does. So are you basically saying here that actually we have a choice about, you know, how we react or respond to uncertainty, and the ability, because it pushes into this state of this optimum state of learning that you're talking about, that the real opportunity here is actually we see it as a excellent opportunity to learn and to actually understand more.
Yeah, Yes, we do, and it's almost more than a choice. It's a trait. There is a human trait that we all have that's called uncertainty tolerance. It was discovered in the 1990s. Every one of us has it. It sounds a little bit uncomfortable, but it's not like the average intolerance. And it's been studied thousands of times. There's so many papers on it. There's meta analysis of uncertainty tolerance. There's a relatively reliable area of science that we can draw some conclusions from. Low uncertainty tolerance is shown to lead to groupthink, self-doubt, exhaustion, because uncertainty affects us physically as well as intellectually. Whereas high uncertainty tolerance is causally linked to more strategic decision making, more creative problem solving, higher rates of empathy. I mean, the studies about this go into all manner of different areas. Around elections, for example, people are less drawn towards extremism or conspiracy theories. You can handle nuances better the higher your uncertainty tolerance. In terms of diversity, you're more able to tolerate different thinking, different ideas, people that you disagree with, people you even might dislike or be scared of. Uncertainty tolerance has a really profound implication on tackling some of society's largest challenges, but also just getting you through the week and dealing with the conflicts and the conundrums that present themselves to us. And so, yes, the difference between anxiety and creativity, or fear and excitement, triggered by the brain when unexpected circumstances take place, the lightning fast response will be informed by your uncertainty tolerance.
So if you were a leader of an organization, let's say, or I guess just personally as well, if you wanted to improve your uncertainty tolerance, if you wanted to actually get better at learning from uncertainty and feeling more comfortable with it, what would you do? What can you do?
I mean, the trite answer, I'm sorry, I have to say, is that you can come on the Uncertainty Experts, because we run programs for leaders all around the world. But the underlying thing that I think is probably useful for leaders to get their head around is on the whole, leaders are shown in our study, we've had over 20,000 people go through the study, to have a higher uncertainty tolerance. And that's not surprising at all. The highest uncertainty tolerance of any group that comes through it is entrepreneurs. And again, that's not surprising. The lowest is young people. And that is surprising, because their tolerance to uncertainty chemically should be higher. But I think it speaks to the epidemic of anxiety that the younger generation seems to be facing. But the challenge is, if a leader has a high tolerance to uncertainty, but their team has a low tolerance to uncertainty, that will create a sense of dissonance amongst a team, and it becomes really problematic. And the thing that I would give away to leaders is the first part of a research. So you can test this with your team. Ask what they think about uncertainty. And in my experience, universally, you'll get a balanced response. People will say, well, it can be a bit of a pain in the neck. I don't necessarily like it, but I can see that it brings some opportunities for growth. If you ask someone how uncertainty makes them feel, in our research, about 85–90% of the responses will be negative. And this is the key difference. Uncertainty is usually approached as a theoretical or cognitive challenge. And usually the mistake is made, and we deal with uncertainty in terms of risk. But true uncertainty, aka the unknown, is something that affects us in an embodied way, in an emotional way, and a very deep way. And so our responses to uncertainty has to be equally psychobiological, equally dualistic. We need a cognitive approach, and we need a body-based or an emotional approach. And if you don't, this is why most approaches to change fall over. Change readiness and change resistance, two well-identified states, are defined by someone's emotional capacity to get on board with that change. We can all theoretically agree with change, but if you're ever wondering why your change plan isn't what it was supposed to be 3 months after the point that you launched, or day one, because emotionally sabotage takes place. So when we've asked this question, how does uncertainty make you feel? And we've seen thousands upon thousands of adjectives describing the different states that it makes people feel. They all cluster conveniently into 3 states. The first and the greatest number of responses are words like makes me anxious, makes me scared, makes me fretful, makes me sleepless. We call that fear. The second is uncertainty makes me feel indecisive, makes me feel confused, makes me feel a bit circular. That makes me feel foggy. We call that fog. And the third is uncertainty makes me feel stuck, makes me feel listless. It makes me feel like I've lost my mojo. And so we call that stasis. So fear, fog, and stasis has become the framework for all of our tools. This is a useful thing for leaders to get their head around. FFS is also my favorite acronym, and it's the basis of our now published peer-reviewed paper. But the point is, it's very hard for people to articulate or even admit that's how they feel. Those are not good states. but there has never been anybody that said a state that's outside of those three. So someone who is, most teams going through reorgs, restructures, and whatever the incarnation of uncertainty is, inside and outside of work, feeling those states will be in a moment of change resistance. And that's the real thing. Are we in a place of attraction? We're moving towards, or are we moving away from? And this is why uncertainty has such a degree of duality to it. When you're affected on that level and you're feeling something akin to one of those three states, you are not going to be moving towards change. And so this has become very useful in the lexicon of leadership, because you've got to understand you need a psychobiological response to it, and you need to give people tools of emotional regulation and embodied cognition if they're going to be able to move through uncertainty. Because to do so successfully, you need to be able to think and feel your way through uncertainty.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I think if I can relate this back to your book, Be More Pirate, I mean, that book was brilliant about taking more creative risks, right? So, and I'm interested to ask you a bit more about the relationship between creative risk taking and uncertainty and people's response to uncertainty. Does it make us more or less likely that we're going to take creative risks?
Yeah, it does. And again, this is deep in the human psyche. I think for me, there's a really clear through line between Be More Pirate and uncertainty experts. But Be More Pirate was surprisingly good at getting people to step off the edge of the map. After that book came out, I had to create. There's now a global community that began as a folder in my inbox that I didn't know what to do with, of people writing to me to say, I've started my own social enterprise. I've created a new initiative at work. I've stood up to the difficulty that I was challenging. I've started a relationship that I was scared of. I've stopped a relationship that I was scared of. Huge shifts in people's life. And then I began to grow this community and speak with them regularly. And you'd realize how scary it is once you're off the edge of the map. Once you've taken that creative risk, you're kind of on your own. And this is something that we'll all be familiar with. And it's a direct aspect of leadership. When you finally get close to something that's genuinely new and you're reaching into the unknown, the internal reflex is to reach for what's already known. And there we find ourselves locked in this paradox that just when something like, it's why I think in a way the fear of success is even greater than the fear of failure, because you've got so much to lose and you're on the precipice of something wholly new. And so there's a direct, genuine creativity. Like look around us at the moment. How many commissioners are tapping into our collective conscious need for security and stability that sits behind these reboots of so many formats. We're craving a false sense of certainty. How many politicians are selling us backward-looking narratives? Look at the policies that are being put forward in this year of more elections than ever before. It's just a rerun in exactly the same way Tagashi's Castle is. But that's because we desperately crave it. We crave false certainty, and it's psychologically known as safety behaviors. In a moment of uncertainty, we reach for false safety and security. And that might be a bottle of wine, it might be 2 bottles of wine, it might be doom scrolling, it might be whatever your habits are, but they never make you more safe. They just protect us from this feeling of uncertainty. And the only way through it is to step further into the unknown. And that's where this relationship with creative risk really comes. And so in one sense, uncertainty experts is how I tried to answer the fear of stepping off the edge of the map and being on your own, because now you need tools to navigate this unknown state and not go back to what you previously knew.
Yeah, so I mean, it's so interesting because I work with a lot of organizations around organizational agility. And one of the important things there is understanding the context of the situation, situational awareness and the kind of decision that you're making. So the idea of like 3 types of problem in the world, for example, simple problems, which are basically where you need that kind of linear approach because you have to do things in the same way every single time. And then complicated and complex problems where you might have done it before, so you understand, you have some experience in that decision. And complex adaptive problems where it's unknown, right? So here, what you need to do is to be more emergent in your approach. You break down the big thing into smaller things, you test and learn in order to navigate through. And I'm just interested to know your reaction to that kind of thinking around how you navigate uncertainty, breaking things down, testing, learning, understanding the way forwards by getting feedback regularly. Is that something which actually marries nicely with what you're talking about there, about how we tend to approach uncertainty?
Yes, absolutely. I looked a lot, and I worked with the Santa Fe complexity Institute. So I thought complexity was going to be the science that would help me explain these stories and bring them to the world. But the challenge with complexity, ironically, is it's pretty hard to understand, or it hasn't done a brilliant job of communicating itself yet. Largely, there seems to be these two states, right? We're moving towards things or moving away things. And this relates to the point of problems, because the wickeder the problem gets, the more complex the problem gets, the more you need to rely on emergent. This binary system doesn't work anymore. To be truly emergent, you have to be available. And I think this is the third state that our work begins to point to. But it's very hard for leaders to do, because what we're now experiencing is your ability to tolerate doubt and indecision. And there's no leader that's grown up through any kind of MBA of the last 20 years where doubt or indecision was ever taught to be a good thing. But being available, I think, is what I would offer to this part. But by maintaining availability and avoiding the compulsion towards attraction or avoidance is how we allow for emergence to begin to arrive. And increasingly, I think there's a fourth state, which is we make a mistake for things that are no longer problems but have become paradoxes, and there simply is never going to be a clear choice between them. And I don't know what the percentage would be, but I'd guess that probably about 10% of anything a leader is trying to work their way through now as a problem will actually be a paradox, and there just won't ever be a clear choice. There will be a degree of of these two states, and they will coexist, and that becomes quite difficult. The real paradigm for me, though, in leadership in those moments is almost the fifth state, that there is no solution. And in a moment when leadership is called to be as authentic and as vulnerable and as honest as possible, because trust is the ultimate currency of leadership, it's pretty hard when the only honest answer to lots of the problems that are presented is, I don't know. I don't know. And there's this very gray area between heuristics, rule of thumb, wisdom, experience, and regurgitating stuff that you've done before because you're falling on patterns of behavior because you don't know what to do, right? So how do you distinguish between that as a challenging thing? And then truly, with the complexity of information around us, you simply cannot be expected to know how all the answers. So how on earth do you turn around and in an inspirational fashion say, I don't know? And few and far between are the teams who want to hear, I don't know, from their leader, even though it's the truth. And so there's this dichotomy in that space. And what I would offer to leaders brave enough to be able to try to hold the space of doubt, what we've seen people, when we first launched Uncertainty Experts, we were approached by lots of senior firms, Netflix, Nike, Google, Lego, great firms have been through the program. And they said, right, we get it. This is the update on resilience. Uncertainty tolerance is the next step. I want you to give our teams confidence and clarity. And sadly, we can't. We can definitely teach them tools that will help them manage their fear, sure, and turn that back into a healthy relationship. And we can show you how to turn doubt into a place of agility, absolutely. But the skills required are curiosity and collaboration. Confidence and clarity have left the building. And so the answer to the question is, I don't know, but I believe that we can work it out together. Or I don't know, but I know how we can start to work this out together. And I think that's the update. And it's really hard. I've been trying to do a meta search on leadership speeches, looking for leaders who know how to say, I don't know well. And there's only one leader who consistently uses that phrase, which is Obama. And he did it really, really well. But I think that's the paradigm we're moving towards, because it's, what's beyond purposeful leadership, I think, is transparency. And transparency is incredibly hard to do without finding yourself in the space where you have to admit there are paradoxes to which there aren't clear answers. And that's the world we're operating in. And so I think, if you put it on the most senior leaders I know, who upon them, it's, their job to invest in technologies that don't exist yet to meet targets that have already been missed. That's not a bravery question. That's an uncertainty question.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating. I think as you were talking there, I was just also thinking about decision making, I guess. And there was a really interesting book I read. Annie Duke, who was the ex kind of world poker champion, who wrote a book called Thinking in Bets, and she was talking a lot about how there's a real blind spot that we have about decision making, where we rate our decisions by their outcomes. And she said that's quite misleading in a complex and uncertain world. That basically we say, well, if there was a good outcome to that decision, that was a good decision. If there was a bad outcome, that was a bad decision. But actually, winning and losing are kind of loose signals of decision quality. You can still make a really good decision and end up with a poor outcome, perhaps because of circumstances beyond your control. So I guess just what's your reflection really in thinking about decision making amongst uncertainty, and that kind of idea of how we see decisions by their outcomes?
What a great question. So there's two things I'd offer to that. I've been asking a question that relates to it in the last few months. And the question I ask is, in a moment of uncertainty, would you prefer to be seen as decisive, even if you knew that led to a negative outcome, or indecisive if you knew that would lead to a positive outcome? And this speaks to the paradigm I think that we're moving through, of the idea of leadership having to be, on a mantle, giving clarity in 240 characters. And 70% of people say they'd prefer to be seen as decisive, knowing it would lead to a negative outcome. And we'll just pause on that for a second and look at the mess around us and begin to understand how those things might connect. And then when we extrapolate that data out to just SLT and above, leadership and above, it goes up to 90%. So profound is the narrative of leadership that it is more important to be seen as decisive, that we will choose that to the tune of 90%, even if we're guaranteed that leads to a negative outcome. And we don't give any interpretation of what negative outcome is. But let's assume everyone knows it's money, time, stress, and how all of us have been in teams where we've had leaders and we've watched them say something they don't believe in, that's made up, that's a rushed policy decision, that's a headline that needs to be said, and we've spent weeks tidying that up. I mean, it's kind of a summary for modern democracy, isn't it? So I think that's one aspect, which is it shows we're so wedded to false certainties, false security, that we will suffer pain. There's a funny study. It's not really a funny study. There's a study which has an amusing interpretation to it that King's College did. 750 participants were given the choice between a simulation of uncertainty and the chance to give themselves an electric shock. Within about half an hour, all participants had given themselves an electric shock. We prefer pain to uncertainty, and everyone knows it. There's lots of studies around negative health diagnosis. People prefer a negative health diagnosis to remaining alone. Or if your train or plane has ever been delayed, you'd much prefer to know it was 2 hours delayed rather than it's just indefinite. Like the examples are all there. So when it comes to decision making, a similar thought comes through to me about what's really useful. The skills that the Decision-Making and Uncertainty Center came up with after 10 years in existence, and my cohort of interviewees, was very much about the importance of embodied decision-making, or intuition, or gut instinct. This becomes the most powerful tool you've got when you don't have a full set of reliable information and data. And we know that we're going through a period of time where there's an over-deference to data and an under-reliance on human instinct and experience anyway. But when you bring these two things to bear, something really incredible happens. The body, with its 50 million data points, 50 million, the body can read 50 million points of information at the same rate that the brain can process 50. So the compression rate between brain and body is huge. And yes, the body's working out temperature and angles and balance, but it's also working out trust and proprioception and interoception and lots of other really significant things. So when we start to look at the science of gut instinct, we realize how reliable it is. Embodied cognition is the scientific term for it. It's considered to be this very hot topic in cognitive sciences, because effectively the argument is the brain has two decision-making centers, or in shorthand, two brains. And in some tests, they're equally reliable. Yet we know the hierarchy is still cognitive first. But where it starts to get really interesting is the brain doesn't really deal with abstract concepts very well, like time. So a really profound memory can stimulate very real present emotions, as can a dream, as can good art and culture. But a well-synthesized piece of scenario planning, like really going into a future place and not just mapping out the probabilities of what may happen, but trying to inhabit the feeling of what might happen, coloring it, using narrative, using theater, using the skills that humans have of storytelling. Gut instincts that can be picked up about a future state are just as reliable in an imagined future state as they are in a present state. So if you can truly simulate a dilemma that you've got next week, whether it's where to go on holiday or which investment to make or which team member to back, you can take that, is that quite right? Did that feel okay? If you are someone who knows and can trust, and this is, if you want the full science jargon, somatic marker theory, what is that signal in my body and what does it mean? If you regularly reflect on this, it becomes a very reliable tool. And when matched up with our best available rational decision making, we arrive at a place where humans make decisions that is uncompeted with. We know that the LLMs and most machine learning is all based on cognitive processing. There is no software that I know that's even in development that is based on emotional decision making. So we have a capacity to make the very best decisions of our lives if we bring these two things into union. And there is a narrative at the moment that speaks to a deference to cognitive only models. And there's a real opportunity to align these two decision making centers to get to the best decisions we've got. Because the cost, I think, not necessarily good or bad. No one knows what the outcome is going to be, and no one knows what the outcome of that outcome is going to be. But I do know that the feelings matter. Resentment is a very costly emotion, as in it's physically costly. It releases chemicals that are painful to experience, and they last an awful long time. Whereas guilt, less so. So a really bad decision, I would measure on how it affects you, and how it then will inform its shadows will update your predictive abilities of what's going to come. So someone who's made a series of bad decisions, to me, would be someone who's become limited in their capacity for risk because their predictive model of the world has become narrow. Someone who's made good decisions, even if they've haven't played out well financially or in the short term, is someone who's become more expansive, more opportune, and more open-minded as a result of them.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying there about over-reliance on data and under-reliance on emotion and intuition and gut feel, I suppose. I guess, we hear a lot, don't we, about data-driven decision-making and the importance of, going back to the data. And it seems like, as you say, that really is all powerful at the moment. But what you're saying, seem to be saying there, is that actually, I guess maybe data informed, which is where you obviously look at the data, but then you also bring in that kind of gut feel, that kind of emotional decision making, that becoming much more important, perhaps, in terms of navigating particularly uncertain environments. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd go so far as to say, and I think this will help in that leadership space where I know this can sound difficult, but I'd go so far as to say that emotions are data. Emotions are data points. They signal in your body at a faster rate than your brain can process. They act with speed, and they're reliable, and they have 300,000 years of incredible efficacy at keeping you alive. They have a better track record than any kind of technologically produced data whatsoever. And here we are in each and every single one of us at the rate of about 1 quadrillion to 1 when you count up all the probabilities of every single ovulation cycle or whatever that's led to our existence. I think 1 quadrillion to 1 is, I think I'm quoting that even accurately. And so we have a very reliable set of data. And those of us who are more in tune with it, we've got a lexicon around it which doesn't do it justice. But 200 years ago, the separation of brain and body is largely now considered to be a mistake. And as we are, whether it's ancient spiritual practices, actually that makes them sound awful, doesn't it? 2,000-year-old wisdom points in this direction, as does cutting-edge neuroscience. The best of our decisions are going to be when both of our decision-making systems are aligned.
Yeah, I love that. And I just to go back to something you were talking about earlier on about leadership and leaders just saying, I don't know. The thing that struck me when you were saying that was about humility and just leaders, the importance of having humility to kind of say when you don't understand or don't know something. There was a phrase actually which popped into my head, which I think comes from Microsoft. Actually, it was a thing that became Satya Nadella was undertaking a bit of a cultural transformation of Microsoft, and I think they had this phrase, "From know it all to learn it all." And that struck me as a really kind of interesting way of thinking about actually leaders don't have all the answers, particularly in an uncertain or complex world. But actually one way through this is to say, I don't know, but we're going to find out. And this is how we're going to find out. So do you think that might be kind of a useful kind of way of framing that?
Yeah, I do. I remember reading that and I thought it was absolutely spot on. We cannot possibly expect people to know it all, but we can expect them to try to learn it all. I think it's something along those lines. But even then, the second point is pretty difficult, because how on earth are you supposed to learn it all? And yes, I think it's humility. I think it's also honesty. I think it's the acceptance that maybe doubt has a place in good decision making. And I think it's I think the skill set of leadership is shifting, and decision making is as much about discernment as it ever was about being decisive. And sometimes I think we even misinterpret being decisive. It's not just about getting to the decision. It's about our ability to hold off on being forced into decisions. And I think very often the role of a good, really strong leader at the moment is being able to hold space. Colin Powell is a tricky leader to cite, really, because Americans' military history is not really one that, anyway, let's not go there. But nonetheless, Colin Powell as an individual, I think we can respect for his ability to transcend multiple different administrations of the political spectrum. His famous line is the 40 to 70 rule. If you have less than 40% of the available information, then you're definitely in the dark, right? And you shouldn't do anything. But if you wait until you've got over 70% of the information, you're going to miss the opportunity. And so somewhere between 40 and 70 of amount of the information, you have to fill that gap with something else. And that's going to be your judgment, your intuition, your instinct. And I for someone who has made decisions probably more than most other human beings in recent history that have affected more lives, I find that a really interesting articulation of this, of the balance of what we should be looking for that we can rely upon, and then that what we need to look into ourselves for, and the expectation that we can't know it all. And I think what it also points to is that sometimes people hide behind data and data-informed decisions. That point I said earlier on, safety behaviors are what we recourse to when we're feeling unsettled, and they're very often, shorthand is a fake safe. So in our research, when we ask people about safety behaviors at home, once we've explained what they are, it's very classically alcohol, snacking, binge watching, starting fights. We've all done those. Why am I in this fight? And it's, because I was feeling really uncomfortable and I can have some control over here. At work, it's starting meetings that aren't necessary. It's CCing people onto emails to cover your back. It's procrastination and, opinion seeking in an excessive way, or, distraction projects. Like, in every single one of us has been involved in one of those processes. And it's because the actual genuine new work that's in front of me, or the uncertainty that I have to go and do, is so horrific. And again, that's my subconscious, my emotions are pulling me away from it at a speed that my brain can't even process. So I'm not yet even aware that's what's happening. Oh, but look, here I am suggesting a meeting that we don't need. These are well-trained patterns of behavior into me, which I know work, and I know it keeps me busy, and I know it keeps me safe. And so, yes, I can totally understand that some of these things don't feel comfortable in modern leadership parlance when we're supposed to be operating at a very advanced cognitive level. But I would suggest the most advanced level that we can be operating at is when we recognize the capacity of human emotion to trip up the very best of our thinking. And if we don't bring them together, uncertainty, it's like the old VUCA framework, still a very useful framework. But in my observation now, where we go wrong is to mistake the fact that uncertainty, the kind of key letter in that acronym, is a feeling as well as it is anything else. Uncertainty is emotion. And if we try to think our way through something that we feel deeply, no wonder we don't get past change readiness. That's the difference between change readiness and change resistance. In all of the studies around those two different states, we only move from change resistance to change readiness when we are emotionally on board with the change as well.
Brilliant. Sam, we're running short on time, unfortunately, but just one more question, if I may, which is, I guess, just a kind of to bring it together. If you are someone watching or listening to this podcast and thinking about what are the one or two things that I can start to do immediately to just help me develop habits which help me to navigate uncertainty better, what would those one or two things be?
Like all good phobia treatment, the medicine is, the poison is the cure. And uncertainty, you will find everyone has their different capacity for uncertainty. So when you know what it is, when you can identify it, treat yourself to it, begin to play with it, have some fun with it. So for some people that might be ordering off menu and discovering something that you hate or you like. For some people it might be a different genre that you'd never watched and discover something magical that they then, and the upside of that would be all of a sudden you've discovered this great new story that you get to tell at dinner and you have a bit of social currency, or you find out something you dislike. The key is to have chosen intentional moments of uncertainty and then reflect on them. So that would be one, just go out of your usual patterns and paths and reflect on the growth that you feel as a result. And the second would be probably the starting point skill that I will give you. The technique is called interoception. It is the 8th of all the human senses. So we have sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, the ones that we're all familiar with. Interoception is the eighth, and it is this thing that will turn emotions into data. It is your ability to interpret your internal signals. So my daughter over here now has good interoception. She can tell when she's nervous and when she needs a wee, right? And there's a difference between those two things, even though they might at first feel kind of similar. Do you, dear listener, know the difference between the anxiety caused when the budget's changed, leadership's changed, or one of your teams resigned, and the anxiety, when it's something personal? There are different signals taking place inside us, and our skill of interoception will allow us to determine whether there's a real threat or you just need to take some deep breaths, whether you're in a meeting and you just need to move through unexpected news, or whether you need to take action, whether it's a feeling or whether it's a fact. And interoception is the skill that will allow you to do that. And in the Uncertainty Experts, it's the first thing we teach because it's the 101 of emotional regulation, which will then allow for you to tolerate the uncertainty, which will then lead to greater agility and creativity.
Amazing. Sam, that's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on to Firestarters. And if you're watching and you enjoyed that episode, please share it. And of course, do subscribe. But my thanks go to Sam Conniff for a brilliant insights there into navigating uncertainty. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everyone, for listening, watching, and taking part.